Hey, good morning, everybody. We're going into lesson number 5 on natural selection evolution. We're going to look at a little bit of evidence of evolution and a little bit of kind of like the way organisms evolve, like speciation is what we're going to talk about a little bit today. So let's get started. So kind of a key concept, which we know, but at the time it really wasn't understood, is that all organisms on Earth are related. We all come from a common ancestor. We go back far enough, every organism in this world all comes from the same unicellular organism, the first cell that was living. And that seems, it is amazing, but it's also evidence of evolution. And we can see it in similarities in organisms, right? If we look at common ancestors and we look at like ourselves and our body plans are fairly similar to apes or chimpanzees, which would be our closest relatives. You can see that although our body plans have changed, right, but there's a lot of similarities there, which is evidence of evolution. So some relationships are easier to see than others, though most organisms have some similarity in body structure, which we'll talk about. Okay, so you got the 5 organisms there, and then me in the window kind of matches the sizing of the pictures. Any case here, if we look at it, these are all different organisms, right? We have a chimpanzee, we have a silverback gorilla, we have a dog, we have a cardinal, we have a dolphin. All very, very different organisms. But if you look at the general body plans of them, they all have very similar body plans. So we have 4 mammals on the slide now, and 1 bird, right? So this dolphin's a mammal. But if you look at them, they all have kind of like a central torso, like a central body. Above their body, they have a head. They all do in their body structure. So central body, a head. Excuse me. Central body, a head. Central body, a head. And then projecting from that torso, from that central body, they have limbs, right? So there's 2 legs, 2 arms, 2 legs, 2 arms, 4 legs, right? But still kind of coming out at the same general region. 2 legs and 2 wings, very similar structure. And then here it doesn't have 2 legs, but it has its flipper right on the back end, which would kind of match up with our leg structure in a sense. And then it's 2 flippers on the side, which kind of match up with our arm structures. In fact, so the bone structure of a dolphin's flipper is very similar to the bone structure in our hands, which is amazing. So there's a lot of similarities here, and this is all evidence of evolution, right? Natural selection found a body plan that worked, and it stuck with it. And all animals kind of follow, not everything in this world, but most animals follow that same similar body structure, body plan. So it's just evidence that we all come from common descent. It's just common descent is that we all have common ancestors. So living things have slowly changed over time. Each living species descended from other species over time. This is the principle of common descent. All living things share a common ancestor. So that's what we've been talking about. People that study anatomy, so anatomists, discovered that when comparing adult animals with 4 limbs, similarities exist among the bones of various types of arms and legs, which is why I kind of like referred to a couple slides ago. Once you kind of find the body plan in nature, it sticks with the body plan. So, dolphins are mammals. Their ancestors were once on land, terrestrial. They moved back into the ocean, so they've evolved away from a body plan that looks very similar to us, but they still have a lot of similarities in their body plans, especially in the structure of their bones and their flippers. So because of common descent, there's a lot of similarity in structure. And these structures are known as homologous structures. So our arm compared to the arm of a gorilla or to the arm of a chimpanzee to the leg of a dog or the leg of a horse, those are all homologous structures. If I look at the bone structures that make it up, there's a lot of similarities in bones that are there. Now, they're not exact, but there's a lot of similarities. Right, and they're known as homologous structures. If you remember, you might have heard the term homologous when we talk about chromosomes. Homologous chromosomes are chromosomes that are similar but not identical. So the chromosomes you got from mom are homologous to the chromosomes you got from dad, right? They can't contain the same genes, just different forms of those genes. Homologous means similar, but not identical. So in terms of structures, we have homologous structures in organisms. And it means that they came from a common origin, right? You're not going to develop 2 different arms that look the same with the same bone structure on two separate lineages. Doesn't make sense. It's most likely like they came from a common ancestor and then they've evolved to be slightly different from each other. So here's a picture of some homologous structures. So here's the leg of a frog, a lizard, a bird, human, cow, whale, bat. And what's amazing about this, these are all different organisms, right? So we have a flying bat, right? We have a whale that swims. We have cows and cows that are more kind of larger mammals, humans for grasping, frogs for jumping, lizards obviously ancestors but further away. But if you look at the bone structure, and you have to kind of see the words here, the humerus bone, right? So the humerus is this bone right here, right? The humerus bone is present in all of these organisms. See, in your wrist bone, you have a radius and an ulnar, right? The radius and the ulnar, right? You can see here, radius and ulnar, radius and ulnar, radius and ulnar, radius and ulnar in a bat, radius and ulnar in a whale, radius and an ulnar in a cow, radius and ulnar in a human. So even though all these structures are very different and they serve different purposes, right? They don't have the same function. The function of a cow's leg is very different than the function of a human hand, is very different than the wing of a bird, is very different than the legs of a lizard, right? But they have similar structure. So similar structure, but different function is another way to think about homologous structures. So I like to kind of say it that way. So homologous structures have similar structure, but because they came from a common ancestor, they have similar structure, but because they've evolved into different species, they kind of serve slightly different functions at this point. Okay. Now, in terms of kind of evidence that we all came from a common ancestor, there's a lot of similarities in our embryos. So if you look at like the developing fetus of a human compared to the developing fetus of a chimpanzee or of a sheep or of a pig, if you look at that fetus early on, its very early stages, it's tough to distinguish between them, right? You'd actually have to kind of know what you're looking at. If we looked at it just briefly, you'd be very hard to kind of tell the difference between a developing fetus of a cow or developing fetus of a human or developing fetus of even a fish. They look very, very similar early on in development. Obviously, they differentiate as they develop, but early on, they look very, very similar. And that is evidence of evolution as well, showing that we have a common ancestor. The other thing would be vestigial organs. Vestigial organs are structures that seem to have no function. Like the key vestigial organ that we think about with us, it's not quite vestigial, but it serves a different function. So it does have a function, but is our appendix is oftentimes called vestigial. The appendix is a remnant excuse me, is a remnant of when we used to eat, when our ancestors, long thousands and thousands, millions of years ago, not millions, but thousands and thousands of years ago, used to eat more plant-based diets. When you're eating grass and plant-based diets, you really need to digest cellulose. Like a cow eats grass, and we eat grass, we can't digest grass. So our ancestors did eat more plant-based diets. So we needed a digestive system that would allow us to digest that material. And the appendix was thought to play a role in that process, that digestion. So therefore, our diet was kind of similar to more of a grazing animal diet, like a cow or a horse or something like that. We've evolved. We eat a lot more less complex carbohydrates. We eat more proteins and fats. Like our diets change. We think, that higher calorie food, more potent food led to the development of brain, larger brains, and thought process was kind of a theory. And so when our diets changed, our digestive system changed. We ate less plant-based material, less cellulose. So therefore, our appendix wasn't really used anymore. So it kind of got smaller and smaller over time. And now you just have this little remnant of an appendix that's left. We say it's vestigial because we think, it doesn't serve any purpose anymore. But we actually think that the appendix does still serve a function for us because we think it kind of holds good bacteria for us, like a storage sac. Hence, it stores good bacteria, but there's always a chance bad bacteria can get in there, and that's when you have an appendicitis. Other vestigial organs are whales have hip bones. Whales don't really need hip bones, but their ancestors once walked on land, were once terrestrial, so those are vestigial organs as well. Okay, so this is just kind of a big picture slide. I'm going to read through it and then I'll explain it. So each species has a toolkit containing visible and invisible tools that perform essential survival functions. Toolkits are the result of millions of years of evolution by natural selection. It is easier to modify existing tools than it is to create entirely new ones. So once something works in nature, so once there's a body plan, hence, right, torso, head, 4 appendages, works, nature sticks with it. Now, they can do slight modifications around it, but it doesn't really typically, something new is not necessarily created afterward. If it works, it works. Right? So you can think about it as like a toolkit. I have all these different tools in my box and I can use all these different tools, but I can have different combinations of those tools and slightly modifications of those tools. Right? Good evidence of this is we are not evolving to become a perfect species. No organism is evolving to become this perfect species because we simply evolved to kind of fit in the environment that surrounds us. And the concept of that are we kind of just do slight modifications of structures or traits that are already there. Good evidence of that is our eye. The human eye is awesome. It's amazing. But there are flaws in our human eye. There are blind spots. It's not quite structurally sound. The retina isn't well attached, so therefore you can have detached retinas and you can have damage to your eyes. So if we were designing an eye, we would design an eye that was far superior to the eyes that we have now. Although our eyes are great, there are flaws there. There are problems with it, which is just evidence that, hey, you know what? Natural selection isn't trying to create this perfect organism. It's just simply looking at what traits exist, and some organisms survive, some organisms do not survive, and the ones that survive have the traits that get passed on. So because our eye functions and it works, even though it's not perfect, nature's not going to go, oh, let's scrap it and start over again. It can just make slight modifications of the existing traits that are there. One last thing before we kind of go into a slightly different topic here is we last couple lessons we kind of got to the idea that, you know, instead of just the big picture of natural selection is the evolution of new species, like seeing, you know, the evolution of a new bird or a new lizard, right? We need to kind of break that down to very, very small pieces of natural selection, which are like changes in allele frequencies. So again, the example we gave was like a mouse population. If the mouse population moves to a slightly different patch of forest that has darker coloration, you would think that the fur color, the hair color in the mice might turn a little darker over generation after generation after generation. So that's not really easy to see, but if we kind of look at their genetic makeup of the population, we would see that genetically the allele frequencies change. The number of dark alleles went up, the number of light alleles went down. So when we look to see if alleles frequencies change, right, it could be evidence of natural selection. However, if you remember Punnett squares are just probabilities. They're not actuality. So they're not actually what's happening. It's just a prediction of what could happen. So with that, there's randomness in the process of mating, right, with new organisms and new generations. So with the randomness, you can have slight changes in allele frequencies that weren't caused by natural selection. They were just caused by randomness in the process of mating, right? And what we call this genetic drift, right? So if I were to cross two heterozygous tall pea plants, so big T, little t, big T, little t. This is blast from the past, right? When you do that cross, it should be a 3-to-1 ratio. So you should get 3 tall pea plants to every 1 short pea plant. But if I, bred and I produced 10 pea plants, could I get 10 tall ones? You could. Is that natural selection? No, it's just randomness in the process of forming alleles and forming gametes and forming zygotes, new organisms, new generations. And that would be considered genetic drift. So it also can be caused by just migration, right? So if I look at the allele frequency of a population and then all of a sudden half that population leaves, there's going to be changes in the genetic makeup of that population, not natural selection. They just left. So that's genetic drift as well, and so forth. Okay. So with this, we're going to kind of talk about the formation of a new species. So we mentioned this in the last couple of lessons, that a species is defined as two organisms that can mate, reproduce, and produce viable offspring, or offspring that are strong, stable, and are able to reproduce on their own. Okay. Speciation is the formation of a new species. I'm going to read through this first. So a new population must change enough that breeding cannot occur with the original population. Genetic changes can be from mutations or natural selection, but must lead to reproductive isolation. So what that's saying is, if we go back far enough, right, the donkey and the horse came from a common ancestor. Okay. There was some type of split in that common ancestor population where, the population that eventually became horses was isolated on one side, and the population that eventually became donkeys became isolated someplace else, maybe geographically. There was a mountain range that separated the two populations. Now, over time, they're in slightly different environments. Their genetic makeup changes a little bit. Something happens over thousands and thousands of years, and then the horse and the donkey meet up again, and they try to mate. You try to mate them, they produce a mule. That mule is not fertile, right? So what happened was a speciation event, right? That common ancestor that was the common ancestor to the horse and the donkey, that population got split. And when it got split, they were separated enough that their gene pools were separate, meaning one population wasn't mating with the other population. And because they were separate for long periods of time, and there was a lot of natural selection, random changes going on, genetically they became so different that they couldn't breed and produce viable offspring anymore. That's how this process takes place. I'm going to give you another example with Darwin's finches. Okay. So the point of speciation is when we say that they're reproductively isolated from one another. So a horse and a donkey are reproductively isolated from one another. It means that when they reproduce, right, they don't produce viable, fertile offspring. A Labrador retriever, right, and a poodle are not reproductively isolated from one another. They're different from each other, genetically different, but they're close enough genetically that they can produce viable offspring in a Labradoodle. Okay. So an example of this would be Darwin's finches. So Darwin's finches started with the process of being geographically isolated from one another. So there was a common finch. There's a common ancestor finch. That population got blown onto various islands in the Galapagos. Now the islands are far enough apart, and they're actually environments dramatically different from each other, that when the finch populations landed on each island, they became really isolated from each other. They didn't intermingle. They didn't breed with each other. So you had separate gene pools of this common ancestor in all these different islands. Okay, so they were geographically isolated from one another, but they're the same species at this point. Over hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years, there were different food supplies, different environments on the islands. So the common finch that gave rise to all these different species, right? That common ancestor started to kind of be selected differently, right? Different traits were selected for in one island compared to another island, compared to another island, compared to another island. So over time, you had this process of geographic isolation led to reproductive isolation, meaning that if we were trying to breed these finches together, they couldn't produce viable offspring. So what that means is we had a speciation event. So we had actually many different speciation events because there's numerous types of finches in all the Galapagos Islands. So this is an example of speciation, the formation of a new species. Again, just summarizing real quick, there was a common ancestor of finch. That common ancestor, which was the same species, right, landed on all these different islands, and the populations became separate from each other. And then over time, because there's different environments, genetic change takes place, natural selection took place. Eventually, they became reproductively isolated from each other. And at that point, they'd be considered new species. We had a speciation event. Okay. Now, this last section is just a little bit different. We're just going to talk about kind of how natural selection takes place. So like some patterns of evolution or pace of evolution is what's saying here. There's two kind of thought processes, or there were two thought processes on natural selection. Some people thought natural selection is just like this slow, steady, very steady, slow change that just takes place over hundreds and thousands and millions of years. So people thought there was a very slow, gradual change in the process or the mechanics of natural selection. Those people in that field, talked about that process as a gradualism. Gradualism is gradual change. Other scientists started looking at it and saying, well, no. It actually looks like there's actually very little genetic change for long periods of time. But then all of a sudden, the environment changes and causes this drastic, quick, rapid evolution, right? So this punctuated equilibrium. So you have long periods of equilibrium that are punctuated by these very, very brief but drastic changes, drastic times of natural selection. So punctuated equilibrium is a view that there are long periods of stability interrupted by episodes of rapid change. A good example of this are mammals. So if you think about it, right, the dinosaurs ruled the earth, right? Meteor hits the earth, right? Dinosaurs die. All of a sudden, the environment has dramatically changed. There's a lot of open available niches, right? Habitats and places for mammals to live. So there were very few mammals at that point, but the mammals exploded at that point because the environment changed. There was a lot of availability, a lot of resources for them to kind of take over these different niches. So mammals stayed very similar for long periods of time. And then right after that, you had this massive explosion of mammals, right? Punctuated equilibrium. The truth is, kind of show you. So here's the punctuated equilibrium model, right? So very little change, rapid change, very little change, rapid change, right? And here's kind of the gradual model, right? Kind of more common, over long periods of time. The truth is, it's actually a little bit of both. It depends on the environment. If the environment is very stable and unchanging, right, you're going to have kind of gradual, slow change for long periods of time. If the environment changes dramatically, right, there's going to be different selection pressures, and you'll have more of a kind of a punctuated evolutionary pace. Right. So really, it's really a combination of both. It depends on the environment, depends on the organism. Okay. Adaptive radiation is when a new species evolves in a relatively short period of time. Adaptive radiation is what happened with Darwin's finches. So I'll kind of give you a second. Well, you can pause it, I guess. I'll go on to the next slide. Adaptive radiation results in new toolkits. So what that means is it results in new traits forming, right? Different organism speciation events, and obviously because you come from a common ancestor, there's going to be homologous structures involved. So here's kind of looking at Darwin's like finches or any event of divergent evolution. Is an ancestral organism, right? That population gets isolated somehow, geographic isolation, different environments over a long period of time. There's natural selection taking place, genetic change takes place, and then all of a sudden you have 5 new species. This species happen to go extinct. These species are extant. So the opposite of extinct, right, no longer around, is extant. So these are extant here, right? And you can kind of look at Darwin's finches as a great example of divergent evolution. Convergent evolution is the opposite, where divergent is a common ancestor evolving away from each other. Convergent evolution is when 2 separate lineages are actually evolving towards one another. So unrelated species may independently evolve superficial similarities because of adaptations to similar environments. Now, you have to understand, if we go back long enough, we all come from the same ancestor, right? We all come from the same trunk of the tree. However, branching happens and organisms evolve away from each other, getting genetically different. But then sometimes organisms will end up in similar environments and start to kind of evolve back towards each other, kind of being similar to each other. So they converge to a similar structures. Now, they're genetically different from each other, but there might be some similarities. Now, what goes along with this is what's known as analogous structures. An example of this, of convergent evolution, were bats and birds. Bats are mammals. Bats, the ancestors of bats didn't necessarily fly. Most mammals don't fly. Many, almost all mammals don't fly. Birds do fly. So bats, kind of over time, natural selection evolved the ability to fly, and they develop wings. However, the wing of a bat is not homologous. Well, it is homologous to the wing of a bird. So actually, I'm going to give you a better example than this. So in any case, bats and birds, right, they evolved to be similar to each other. Another example of this would be insects, right? Flies and birds, or flies and bats, right? Here's a better example of it because it's a more drastic difference, because the bone structure of a bat wing is actually kind of similar to the bone structure of a bird wing. But if I go back further on the tree and I look at insects, this is dramatically different from each other, right? So insects can fly as well. And if I were to analyze the structure of a wing of a butterfly and compare it to the structure of a wing of a bat or a bird, there's no comparison. Now, they both serve the same function, but insects don't have bones. They have exoskeletons. So therefore, there isn't even a bone structure to compare in the wing of a butterfly or the wing of a fly or a dragonfly to the wing of a bird or wing of a bat. So they both evolved the ability to fly, but insects did it very, very differently than birds or bats. So the analogous structures are similar in appearance and function, but they're different structurally. So here's our example here, which I was just kind of talking about. So here, if I look at our butterfly structure, here's the wing of a butterfly compared to the wing of a bat. The bat has all bone structures similar to us. Butterflies don't have bones. So they are analogous structures. Analogous, again, I like to kind of summarize it real quick. We said earlier that homologous were structures that were similar in structure, but different in function, right? Analogous is the opposite. The structures are similar in function. They both function to fly, but structurally they're different. So they're kind of opposite of each other. Okay. One last thing with this, just kind of looking at, that we all come from common ancestors, and, we can actually link some of our structures and some of the things going on in our body to even single-celled organisms. So there's a lot of similarities, like homologous structures, fossils, embryos. We talked about how embryos are very similar between organisms, all show evolutionary relationships, but there's also similarities at the molecular level. So like we're going to talk about yeast in a second, but just big picture is all organisms are based off the same genetic code, based off of DNA. If I take DNA out of a human for a particular protein, I can put that gene into a bacteria and I can get that bacteria to produce that protein. So the fact that we all come from the same common ancestor and we all have the same genetic makeup of DNA. So here's another example: is that DNA leads to proteins, right? There are 20 different amino acids, and what actually organelle actually makes those proteins, right? Are ribosomes, and ribosomes are almost identical in every organism. Even bacteria have ribosomes, which is pretty amazing. Another example would be proteins in yeast. So myosin really is what makes up our muscle fibers. Yeast don't really move around, but yeast have myosin as well. So it's just a great example that we all come from a common ancestor. We're all linked together. And the last thing is you got to talk about is just, biological pathways, right? So if you talk about like glycolysis and cellular respiration, single-celled organisms undergo glycolysis, respiration, photosynthesis. All those chemical pathways are so complex. How could they possibly come or evolve separately from each other? They didn't. It all came from a common ancestor, and they evolved some differences from each other. Well, we'll talk about in class. We'll answer any questions. Hope you guys have a good day. Thank you very much.